Welcome to Bob Rosen, visiting us from Alexandria, Virginia. Bob is a trusted CEO advisor, organization psychologist, and best-selling author of 8 leadership books. It all began with a multi-year grant from the MacArthur Foundation on an in-depth study of leadership. And the fascinating thing to me is being a CEO just being a CEO, given the impact of culture, country, language, and business context. Bob founded healthy companies with a keen focus on transformational change, enterprise digital learning, and the power of being grounded and conscious as a catalyst for personal and organizational success. And we know from the MIT and SIG presentations this fall that in today's environment, showing up as an authentic and strong leader is absolutely critical. So the hope is that this session will not only help you think about new leadership, but your own personal brand and leadership style. For his talk today, Bob will draw on his 2 latest best-selling books. The first, titled Grounded: How Leaders Stay Rooted in an Uncertain World, and Conscious: The Power of Awareness in Business and Life. And this book will be coming to you via carrier pigeon, arranged for and paid by Angus Gephardt at some point in the future. Anyway, give a warm welcome, and if you can, find your reactions tab and perhaps a bit of EF applause to welcome Bob Rosen. Take it away, Bob.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you, Angus, and good morning to everybody. I trust that everybody is in sweatpants and you have your coffee, and good morning to you all. This morning, we're going to have a personal conversation about leadership and the challenges and hopefully the opportunities to navigate through these turbulent times. It's been a tough 8 months. We've had a health and economic and cultural crisis in America. And it gives us a great opportunity to reflect on ourselves and our businesses and the like. One of the things that's interesting is we often talk about the impact of these changes on countries or companies, but rarely do we talk about the impact that they have on us. We simply don't spend enough time looking at ourselves as the world moves faster than our ability to adapt. Genetically and psychologically, we are wired for survival and growth, but we also live in an intensely uncertain world. And the world is becoming increasingly bifurcated. There are those who are adapting and growing and stretching and thriving in the future. And there are those who are falling further and further behind. And with all this change, you can see the difference between the high performers and the mediocre ones. Now, if you look closely and peel back the onion about the impacts that all of this is happening, there are 4, I believe. The first is an intense look at the health and well-being of ourselves, our workers, our leaders, and our organizations. Taking care of ourselves is the #1 job, the first job of a leader. Because if people are not healthy with a true sense of well-being, they will succumb to the stress and the burnout and sabotage themselves and others. Change agility is the capacity to stay agile and adapt to all of these uncertain changing circumstances that will keep us nimble and help to navigate all the change. But we also have to be resilient. We need to master the skill of falling down and getting up and accelerate our own development during all this change. We all know well now that diversity, inclusion, and equity has become a top priority inside business and inside our society. And this is becoming a moral and an economic issue. And the opportunities are huge inside organizations. But the human costs and the economic costs of excluding people are simply too high. And then lastly is this whole major transformation in remote work, as we're showing today. So let me ask you all a question. There's a little bit of a poll here. what is your level of uncertainty and disruption in your life and work? 1, extremely high. 2, somewhat high. 3, neither high nor low. 4, somewhat low. And 5, very low. Why don't everybody just pick a number and let's see what the group is feeling today. How's that poll coming? There we go. So 29% extremely high and 49% somewhat high, some in the middle and a few down at the bottom. A couple interesting things here. One is that the mind and the body has a great capacity to habituate to a level of stress and uncertainty and disruption. And if you look into the future, likelihood that this may be a blip, but we're going to habituate to a much higher level of stress and uncertainty as we move forward. And secondly, there are genetic and psychological differences in terms of how people embrace uncertainty and disruption. Some people love it and they just rise to the occasion with excitement and enthusiasm. And other people are simply scared and they're anxious. And so there are tremendous individual differences. So let's take a look for a second at the next slide, which is where the research is going in this field. I wanted to take a stop here at the business case for why all of this matters. First of all, in the last couple years, there's been an increasing body of research that has shown that high performance organizations, as measured by revenue growth and profitability and market share and customer satisfaction, these organizations are placing a much greater emphasis on a holistic approach to well-being for their leaders, for their workforces, and for the organization as a whole. These high-performance organizations have 1.5 times the level of workforce engagement. They have 2 times the amount of talent retention, 2 times the level of work productivity, and 7 times, just 7 times the level of innovation and creativity. What we need are more evolved leaders, leaders who are able to step up to more advanced values, mindsets, and behaviors that enables them to be agile and adaptive and accountable and responsible to themselves, to their peers, and to their organizations. Frankly, leadership, health, and well-being, from my perspective, is becoming the new leading indicator inside of business. So today, I look through the LinkedIns of people on this call, and boy, there's a lot of seasoned leaders with experience, and I suspect accumulated scar tissue in the room. And I'm going to ask you to wear 2 hats today. One is obviously your organization and business hat, but most importantly, I'd like for you to put a mirror up to yourselves and really look at the impact that this is all having on you. Some of you are in transition, others are corporate jobs, some entrepreneurs, still others in private equity, and others in boards. And so I suspect that what I'm going to talk about here has relevance to everybody. So what's different today? Well, we've spent most of our time in a paradigm that says that what you do defines who you are. If you go to a party, the first question that everybody asks you is, what do you do? And we've become obsessed with action in this society at the expense, I believe, of self-reflection. And we've forgotten how important it is for us to think about what does it mean to be a healthy human being? What you do defines who you are. But there is a paradigm shift that is going on in this country that says that who you are as a human being drives what you do. So what we're going to do is drill down on this whole notion of who you are drives what you do and how you perform. And we're going to talk about 2 kinds of leadership that are interconnected, and with this kind of perspective, the values behind it, and the mindsets and behaviors associated with it, it gives leaders the the strength and stamina and courage and intuition to navigate through all of this change. So let's start with grounded leadership. Grounded leadership is the foundation which helps leaders stay centered and resilient in the face of disruptive change. It's like the roots of a tree that protect us from the winds of change. Now, if you look at this, and this is through our ongoing leadership research, we've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of top leaders in 55 countries around the world, CEOs that is, and an additional group of executives. And what we found is that they have all been mastering these 6 roots. The first is physical health, which is being aware in a fast-paced world. It's how we live. Our emotional health is how we feel. It's about being tough and nimble in uncertain times. Our intellectual health is how we think. It's about being relevant and curious in a very complex world. Our social health is how we connect and relate, both to digital machines and human beings. Vocational health is how we perform. And this is about being competitive, but also having meaning in our work in a very demanding age. And our spiritual health, for lack of a better word, is really how we see the world. And this is being connected to a bigger universe. So what I'd like to do is to just drill down on each one of these very quickly and introduce you to a couple leaders. Physical health is about understanding the connection between our mind and body. It's about managing our energy, both the stress that comes in and the rejuvenation that comes from the inside out. And it's about living a peak performance lifestyle. I worked with Dennis, who was the former global chairman of PwC, for about 12 years, directly and with his teams and organization. And one of the things that Dennis told me is that we all live life on a stool with 3 legs: our work life, our personal life, our family life. And if any one of those legs is vulnerable, the stool is vulnerable. So it's so important for us to live a balanced life. And every 5 weeks, Dennis would take a long weekend, go out on his boat, exercised almost every other day, and really committed to his physical health. Our emotional health is about being self-aware, deeply understanding our strengths and our vulnerabilities, living with positive emotions. You see, we are hardwired for our our difficult emotions like shame and anxiety and anger and sadness, but we're also hardwired for our positive emotions like hope and faith and love and empathy and compassion and generosity. And the best leaders experience and express the full range of their emotions, but they quickly move from their difficult emotions to their positive emotions. And that's what distinguishes grounded leaders. And finally, their capacity to bounce back. I met Nando. He was giving a speech in London several years ago, and I was having lunch with him, and he's a very soft-spoken guy, and he was introduced as the lunchtime speaker. And he got up on stage and mesmerized the audience about his story about a bunch of rugby players in Uruguay and Chile who flew over the mountains. Now, you may know the story now of Alive, and his plane went down and his mother and his sister passed away. And Nando really learned and taught me about the power of emotional health. He exhibited these 3 qualities, and he said this to me. He said, "Don't forget the 4 steps of leading through change. Don't be afraid. Live in the moment, not in the future and not in the past. You can dream in the future and plan in the future, but spend time living in the moment. Follow your heart and never stop changing." That's our emotional health. Our intellectual health is how we think with deep curiosity, but sometimes we lose that curiosity as we leave adolescence into adulthood. Grounded leaders have an adaptive mindset, a mindset that is constantly changing and questioning assumptions about ourselves and the world. And we also recognize that in a complex world, we need a complex mind. And that mind cannot think in either or. It must think in both and in paradoxical thinking. Lego was reeling for many, many years, sluggish growth, underwhelming product launches, and on came Jorgen Knupstorp, the CEO of Lego, for about 12 years. He needed to turn complexity into innovation. So where did he go? He went to his core customer. Who's his core customer? Kids. So he started watching children learn, playing Lego blocks. And he found that these kids were evaluating problems from all angles. There was no single answer. There were multiple hypotheses. They sensed and questioned how they were putting these blocks on. And he realized that he needed to bring that thinking, that intellectual health, back into his organization. He realized that and was the new or. He managed above and below the line. And he was clear to say, I take charge in some things, and other things I absolutely have to let go. That's intellectual health. Social health is how we relate. Clearly, a lot of pressure on leaders to be more authentic. Why? Because people want to have real relationships with their leaders. Now, despite the fact that we're pretty disconnected these days, we are much more connected than we think. In fact, emotions are contagious. Just how do you react if somebody walks into a room with a big smile on their face, or go to the dentist office and feel that person's pain in the dentist chair? Well, Angela Ahrendts is a great example. She was the CEO of Burberry's, and she just recently retired as the SVP at Apple Retail. She meditated every morning. She came in with a morning smile, and her whole commitment was to put employees first. She understood that her job of a leader was to unleash positive energy in the organization. And we're seeing now, with the growth of virtual teams and networks and the importance of nourishing communities like this one, that our social health becomes more important than ever. Our vocational health is how we perform. And let me just tell you the story of Indra Nooyi. Some of you may know her up in that part of the world, but you may not know her history. She was born in a relatively lower class family in India, I believe in Mumbai, and she had a sister, and her mother embedded in her the confidence that she could do anything that she wants to do. She mastered that aspiration and came to the United States and started working as a secretary at PepsiCo. She put herself through Yale School of Management, and she worked up through the ranks all the way to become the highest ranking CEO, I believe, of any major corporation in the world. She had a drive to succeed, a meaningful calling, and a personal mastery. That's vocational health. And then finally, spiritual health. Now, some people like the word spiritual, some people are religious, some people are not. But the way we like to define spiritual health is, do you have a higher purpose? Are you connected to something bigger than yourself? Which is really the foundation for diversity, for understanding culture, for building a global and local mindset, for inclusion, for feeling a sense of stewardship and environmental sustainability. And then also, do you have a generosity of spirit? Do you have a sense of gratitude? Because people have a choice, consciously or unconsciously. They can live a life of alienation and selfishness and parochialism and mistrust, or they can live a life that's interconnected, socially responsive, respectful, and a protector of the environment. I love the story of Paul Pullman. He just retired as the CEO of Unilever. And he said several years ago, to be a great leader, you first must become a great human being. I love that. It says it all. He was in his tenure for 10 years. He had a 300% return, well above the financial markets and his peer groups. He fought back the Kraft and Heinz hostile takeover, and now he's made a deep commitment to environmental sustainability. So here you have it, the 6 roots The 6 dimensions of grounded with 18 roots, all built on the paradigm that who you are drives what you do. So for the business folks who are empirically minded in the room, we've been doing 360 assessments on executives for a long time. And we've divided these executives and leaders in 2 groups, the high health group on these 6 dimensions and the low health group. And we measured the percent of leaders scoring high on leadership performance as rated by their peers, their bosses, and their subordinates. And what you see is all 6 of these predict high performance. What's the highest? Our spiritual health. People want to work for good people who are generous with a higher purpose, and that is becoming more important than ever. So let's do a little poll again. Which grounded dimension of these 6 do you need the most improvement on? Is it your physical health, your intellectual health, your vocational health, your spiritual health, your social health, your emotional health? So just pick one. The ones that you think you need the most improvement in. And by the way, if you have questions or comments, just throw them in the chat, and Jim's going to be helpful to me in kind of collating them, and because I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A and comments. How's that poll coming? There we go. So, smart group. Everybody's got their intellectual health covered. Physical health is always high. And it is really the foundation for speed and agility. But look what is close behind: our emotional health and our social health. I believe our emotional health is going to have the greatest test over the next many years. And those people who are hearty and emotionally healthy are going to be the ones that actually thrive in the new economy. We'll talk a little bit about that a little later. So let me have the next slide, please. There we go. So that's grounded leadership. So let's talk a little bit about conscious leadership, because conscious leadership grows and builds on grounded leadership. Conscious is the accelerant that results in leaders being highly aware and adaptive to lead through change. Now, for years, we aspired to be the smartest person in the room. You remember first grade with the handwriting in the front of the board? I hated Brett Shapiro, who had best handwriting in the room. But being smart is table stakes today. And what distinguishes the very best leaders, we have found, is their ability to be conscious. And we define conscious as, are you aware of yourself? Are you aware deeply of others, their intentions, the impact that they have, your impact on them, and your awareness of your surroundings and your environment? See, conscious gives you the courage and the intuition and the confidence to live with and lead through change. And the more aware you are, the faster you adapt. We've learned this from psychotherapy for years, that if you can help people become aware of their defenses that are trying to hide them from the most difficult, painful issues underneath the surface, you can free them up to adapt and to move forward in their life. So what I'd like for everybody to do is to hit the clap button at the reaction in your survey when I ask this question. Do you think you are conscious in the way I just described it? So let me show you a little data that we collected with the Harris survey. We looked at several thousand workers and executives, and we asked them, how conscious are you? And 94% of executives believe that they are conscious. However, only 60% of employees rate their executives as conscious. So conscious is in the eyes of the beholder in terms of the impact that we're having on other people and the world. So let me give you a couple examples. First example is, I don't know what those red things are. First good example of a conscious leader from my perspective is Reed Hastings at Netflix. Now, Reed had a vision when he started Netflix in 1997 to become a media powerhouse, combining entertainment, technology, and consumerism. But you might not know that Reed had to change himself along the way, as well as change his business model. He had to learn to apologize in public, learning to admit his mistakes when he prematurely wanted to get rid of discs that showed up at our doorstep, and learned how to put his personal values into practice. He's a great example of how conscious leaders succeed. Now contrast that with the executives at Wells Fargo. In September 16, they were ranked as one of the most admired companies in the world. But in 4 years, they've become one of the most reputationally challenged banks in all of the United States. How did they do it? Well, in 2017, their top executives, and I hope I'm not offending anybody who was part of that Wells Fargo team, but I basically started putting pressure on their managers to intensely sell to their customers. In fact, they laid out 8 products that they wanted to sell to every single customer. And they ignored and concealed all of the greediness and self-interest and the customer reaction when they did that. Their top leaders ignored the problem. They weren't really that conscious. After $2 billion in litigation losses, an eroding stock price that continues to erode today, their loss of customers and damage to their brand and reputation, they're still struggling. Now, Charlie Sharp, their new CEO, apparently, I've not met him, is a pretty good guy. But recently a board memo was released that Charlie said, and it was released on September 30th of this year. It's an unfortunate reality, quote, that there's a very limited pool of Black talent to recruit from in order to move executives up. Well, it unleashed a barnstorm, and he opened up Pandora's box, which a lot of companies are facing. Is this a pipeline problem that we don't have enough Black executives, or is it an inclusion problem that we're not opening the doors and embracing them so they can succeed? Well, naturally, as a good CEO, he put out an apology and he decided to put in an executive performance management program evaluating people on their progress to improving diversity and inclusion. An example of a leader that just wasn't that conscious of the impact of his words on his organization. So let's drill down a little bit on conscious and talk about our research about the pitfalls that prevent us from conscious leadership. Well, when we drill down inside organizations, and we're in the business of helping organizations develop workforces that are grounded in conscious and leadership teams, we find that there are 4 areas where people typically trip up. So ask yourself, are you too stagnant in your progress? Are you having trouble moving fast in a world that is constantly changing? Are you too shallow in your self-knowledge? Unfortunately, the people who are too shallow don't know that they're too shallow, and that's part of the problem. But are you going deep enough in your self-knowledge? Are you locked in a box? Are you too small in your perspective? Do you need to break out those walls and think differently about the world? And are you too safe in facing challenges? Are you sitting back when you really need to be walking out on the diving board today? So what's the flip side? What are we finding? Well, first off, conscious leaders get real. They embrace the change. What does that mean? Well, first off, it means that they change their relationship to change. Rather than seeing change happening to them, they see change happening for them. And they get excited about the possibility, even though they may not know what that future looks like today. Another thing is that when the change meter goes up, we want to pull back to stability as much as we possibly can, rather than lean into uncertainty. So there's this shift from stability, which is really a delusion in a world that is constantly changing, to embracing uncertainty. Going deep is experiencing the change, thinking big is expanding the change, and stepping up is energizing the change. So let me just go through. I talked a little bit about changing your relationship to change for getting real. The second part is to face the facts. We're having a national conversation about facts and alternative facts and what that means, but conscious leaders are very clear about trying to discern what is working and what is not working, and what is true and what is not true. And that means that they have to be very, very facile in understanding their assumptions, their mental assumptions about themselves and their businesses and the world. And then thirdly, for getting real, is we're going to have to get more comfortable being uncomfortable, to know what we can and cannot control in business, and to embrace the serenity prayer, if some of you know this, to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. That is about getting real. Going deep is about really helping to develop three parts of our brain: our reptilian brain, which is the most primitive, our emotional brain, which is the source of our memories and emotions, and our executive brain, which is our language and our capacity to adapt and to think strategically. So let me start on the left-hand side. In tomorrow's world, there will be more threats. And we typically experience these threats in our bodies. And so how aware are you of these threats, and how can you manage your threat response to quickly move from a bodily reaction to a set of conscious emotions and thoughts to help you navigate forward? Secondly, is we've got to leverage our positive emotions, as I talked about. I love the story of Oprah Winfrey, because she just provides a great example of somebody who was vulnerable on a public stage, who always seen the cup as half full or at least refillable. And then lastly is we've got to identify our thinking errors. Now, the executive brain, as I said, is the most sophisticated. It gives us grit and persistence and strategic thinking. But our minds can be a liberator or a slayer. A liberator or a slayer. So we must be aware of those thinking errors, like our tendency to want to control or to be perfect, or live a life with a lot of shoulds, or to magnify or catastrophize things. We have to understand what our cognitive biases are and our unconscious biases. And this is coming up a lot in our work in diversity and inclusion and equity. So let's talk a little bit about what it means to go deep. This is a picture of the Dabawala network. It's a 125-year-old lunch delivery service. Thousands of people deliver home-cooked hot food in lunch boxes in Mumbai every day to millions of people. These quote-unquote lunchbox men make less than one mistake in every 6 million deliveries. So what drives these guys to be probably one of the largest supply chain management success stories? Their passion for what they do, the meaning they find in their work, and the desire to live up to the history and reputation. They feel so much pride in their work, and they are exhibiting what we like to call accelerators. Accelerators are attributes inside ourselves that drive us forward in a positive way. whether it's confidence, believing in yourself and your clear values, or courage, practicing grit and persistence to face difficult situations? Or is it faith, demonstrating trust and confidence in a power greater than ourselves? Or resilience, being able to recover quickly from setbacks and adversities? Or even vulnerability is an asset, not a weakness. We have grown up in a world where vulnerability was a weakness. We ran away from it, particularly men and women of an older generation. We need to see vulnerability as an asset, being willing to accept and show our uncertainty and weaknesses to other people. Not necessarily to our employees, although it's good to role model that self-awareness, but certainly to our peers, like you're doing in the executive forum. So hats off to all of you for doing that. We also have to manage our hijackers. I love the story of Michael Phelps. In sport, rare athletes who stand above, giants who tower, and Michael Phelps was at the top. He was discovered at age 11 by Bob Bowman. At 15, he was one of the youngest people to swim in the Sydney Games. He won 6 gold in 2004 in Athens. In 2008 in Beijing, he dominated with 8 golds, and he left in a dream world. But there was something brewing under the water. Soon thereafter, he developed a number of multiple DUIs, drug and alcohol, broken relationships, and you may not know he was suspended from swimming for several months. So he put himself in a mental health treatment facility, and he had to acknowledge that he had lost his center. He had developed this incredible capacity to swim and compete, but his need to be special and his fixation on success and perfectionism did him in. Now you would say, well, he has to be that in order to be the world's best swimmer. Well, maybe, but he doesn't have to be perfect, and he doesn't need to be special in order to feel good. So in 2016, when we found him again in Rio, he had 31 golds around his neck. He was a poster child for those accelerators I talked about. His drive, his desire, his practice, his focus, his resilience, and his confidence. But like all of us, he was susceptible to life's hijackers. We're all vulnerable to being hijacked, and we all have our unique way of hijacking ourselves. For example, just a couple. Are you cautious? Are you overly fearful of change and uncertainty that drives tentativeness and risk avoidance? Are you cynical? Doubting, mistrusting others, and overly questioning of people's motives? Are you fixated on success, being driven by a compulsive and overwhelming need for achievement at all costs? Do you tend to be over-pleasing, and that's created success for you, consistently putting other people's needs above your own? Are you perfectionistic, striving for flawlessness, and setting high performance standards accompanied by harsh self-criticism? And certainly the area of stress and burnout. We each have our own accelerators and our own hijackers. Thinking big is about getting up above ourselves, to be your own drone, to engage in participative observation, to walk into a board meeting or to executive team, and to watch yourself as you're interacting with other people in the room, and to have that knowledge, to be a possibility thinker, to live in the future and bring that future thinking back into the current reality. It's also about developing a Google mind. This is really about being a beginner every time you wake up, being relevant, just like the way Google's search engine works. And thirdly is to leverage your personal ecosystem. It starts with your brand as you're working on inside of the executive forum and in your life. It then involves building wonderful, healthy, strong, productive relationships. And then it's about building a network, your own personal ecosystem. And we find conscious people exhibited qualities in all 3 of these. And then finally, the 4th practice is to step up. It starts with living with just enough anxiety. I wrote a book about just enough anxiety about, God, geez, life goes fast, about 16 years ago. And is a recognition that anxiety is just a part of life, and how we manage it makes all the difference. Do we live life with too little anxiety, which is the face of complacency, or too much anxiety, which is the face of chaos? Or do we live with just the right amount of anxiety inside ourselves that enables us to lead others with constructive impatience? Do you create a healthy environment, but constantly raising the bar and believing your vision of people is bigger than their vision of themselves? I like these 2 leaders. Angela Merkel, she started on the constructive side, and she's learned over her life to be more impatient. And Jeff Bezos, who started on the impatient side, and through trial and error, he's learned to be more constructive. And then finally, one of the important things for conscious leaders is to build a shared consciousness. This is the source of an enterprise mindset, of alignment, of engaging and mobilizing lots of people. This is my favorite baseball team, the Washington Nationals. And it's amazing what they did on their team and in the clubhouse and in the community. They built a shared consciousness about the power of never giving up. So here's a summary of conscious. Moving from shallow to going deep, moving from narrow to thinking big, moving from safe to getting real, and moving from small to stepping up. So what does the data show? Well, we find that the self-aware leaders outperform on the major leadership indices that we measure inside organizations. And when you ask in the Harris poll of thousands of people, employees say 89% would agree or some would agree that their performance would improve if there were conscious leaders running that organization. And similarly, they believe that the organization's financial performance would improve. Finally, let me just leave you with a perspective about how a leader might bring this into their organization. And this is work that we are doing with a Fortune 10 company. And we've found that it's very important to engage senior executives in this whole discussion about the importance of grounded and conscious leadership. Then it's important to engage the middle of the organization through workshops and seminars, as well as technology, and also use internal people to help develop people inside the organization. And then finally, to use what has become incredible digital engagement and technology platforms to help people learn, self-paced and otherwise, on the job. So I'm going to stop there. And it is 9:13, and I wanted to get to about 9:15. And I'm sure that this conjures up lots of reactions and questions. And so why don't we open it up?
Thank you, Bob. There are lots of comments, really loving the perspective and the comment. We have a couple of questions at the organization level and a couple of questions at the individual level.
Great.
So let me link 2 together at the organizational level. Peter Santry asks, help us understand a little bit more about a holistic approach to well-being. And Andy Yost has sort of said this stuff is so important, but how does the organization set goals that are really going to generate a focus on grounded and conscious?
Great questions. To me, it starts at the bottom, the middle, and the top. I have found that sometimes the people at the bottom are the most grounded and conscious people, and sometimes it's the people at the top. And so people, I believe, are hungry, and grounded and conscious is lying dormant inside of people, and they're hungry to become grounded and conscious. So I think that there is a ready customer for this, and the surveys certainly show this. Um, I've interviewed a lot of CEOs and around the world. And one of the things that I found is that the more self-aware and committed to their development the leader is, the more likely they see that the human agenda, the purpose, the values, the leadership, the culture drives the three other agendas: the operations agenda, the marketplace agenda, the finance agenda. The finance agenda is simply a scorecard. And the really great leaders understand that. And so they prioritize, they invest, and they talk about these issues right from the beginning. Frequently, I find that in order to attract the attention of the CEO and to engage him or her, you got to start with where they are. What is their perspective on the world? What are they writing about? What are their business priorities? And how can you integrate grounded in conscious leadership and grounded in conscious perspective into the way they see the world and where they're taking their company? I think part of the question was, how do you get people to see a holistic approach in organizations? Well, the irony of grounded is that we have carved up those 6 dimensions in books and literature, and we do physical health in the healthcare, we do mental health sometimes in meditation, and we do intellectual health in our schools, but people don't show up that way. They show up as holistic people, and all this stuff is connected, and they're good in some things and they're not good in others at certain times. I know when I write a book, every time I write a book, I gain 25 pounds, and my physical health and my emotional health and my stop meditating, my spiritual health goes south, and I got to recommit myself. So I think people want this. And I think it starts with conversation and education. And technology is a great enabler here. We've been really digitizing all of our content for now 4 years and making it available. And people like to learn on their own and with other people. And the technology is enabling people like this to learn together in small groups. So I think that there's a real appetite for this.
Terrific, Bob. One other question at the organization level. Steve Adler is saying, clearly you're saying that the new environment is getting comfortable with the uncomfortable as an organization. But he says there's a balance there about also creating a safe environment, security, trust, the willingness to speak your mind. But while you're feeling very uncomfortable, help us understand how we deal with that dichotomy.
That question comes from an insightful person.
His name is Steve Adler, and
hey,
he's
Steve.
Widely quoted in the EF.
Well, here's the thing, is that it's another paradox, is that, when a leader is driving change or facilitating change, whichever way they are operating, they need to create a psychologically safe environment for people to take risks and to learn and to ask hard questions, to make mistakes, and to experiment. That's all true. But when people lean into the gap between our current reality and our future state, where all the learning, all the change happens, it's scary. And we have to teach our people to learn how to become uncomfortable in psychologically safe spaces. So it's really a both and, not an either or.
Got it. So Jeff Ford says he'd love a comment on Tony Heisch's quote, CEO of Zappos, that says, character is destiny. And he says, yes, and based on this presentation, culture is destiny. And that sort of combined with a question that Deb Wheeler asked, saying, how do you create your own drone, your own Google impact? So maybe you can combine those two.
Sure. Well, let's take the first one first. There has been a very interesting set of studies at the University of Texas, Austin, about what makes for a great president of the United States. And what they've determined is that character alone is necessary but insufficient. What you also need to have is a circumstance. So George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, they all had circumstances, and their character interacted with those circumstances, and they rose to the occasion. It was the same thing in business. Okay, it's just that there are more circumstances these days. And so I agree totally with Tony that character is everything. And in many ways, this is one big, hairy education project in the United States and around the world about character. And hats off to companies. Procter & Gamble's been doing this for a very long time. And so I think that character is very important. But it does interact with circumstance. And you're given an opportunity when you're given a circumstance to show yourself. Now, the second question, remind me what that was, the second part of that question?
Well, the second part of the question was, how do you create your own drone?
Drone. Well, this takes years of work on yourself to be able to not be so blinded by old ways of thinking, to really to have an open mind, a growth mindset, not a fixed mindset, and to ask a lot more questions, to really activate your imagination and your creativity, and to explore things that you haven't explored before. I have one CEO that I coach, and his job, he basically created a job where he was focused primarily on the future and the strategic vision of the company. This is a major Fortune 50 company. And he basically needed to take a day off and commit himself to his intellectual health, to learn to read outside of his industry and to explore different perspectives, get more involved in the marketplaces where he was doing business and where he was not doing business. So sometimes it really does involve committing to our intellectual well-being. I think the best way of being your own drone is to ask people how you're doing. They'll give you the feedback if it's a psychologically safe space to give it.
Well, and this ties into a couple of people have asked about, this is a terrific framework and very in-depth checklist, but it's very challenging because there's so much there. And David Shemero asked, can you talk about leaders who have consciously tried to change their behavior? How have they gone about it? How difficult has it been? And how successful has it been? Well,
the framework is simple and complex at the same time, just like people are simple and complex. So that's why we've sort of labeled it grounded and conscious, and everybody comes in it in a different way. So let me talk about this in different ways. First off is that there are 4 channels that we learn through. The first is the seeing channel, which is our perceptions. How do we see ourselves and how does the world see us? The second challenge is our thinking channel, which is, do we have an open or a closed mind? The third channel is our feeling channel. Are we exhibiting positive or those more difficult emotions? And the fourth channel is our acting channel, which is, are we behaving productively or destructively or unproductively? Now, we have found in our work that in order to get sustainable behavior change, you need to have all 4 of those channels working. Your seeing, thinking, feeling, and acting channel. However, people come at it from very different perspectives. I was working with a leader who poo-pooed all this soft stuff. And so the way that we got him to, and his employees were complaining, his executives were claiming he's too detached, I feel scared around him, I feel like I'm tiptoeing around him. So we basically, and he agreed to this obviously, to talk about his early childhood in Montana, where he captured rattlesnakes and and the like. And people loved it because he brought his humanity to the room. And suddenly he could see it differently, and he was thinking differently about himself. And he felt really good about the feedback that he's getting from other people. Other people come at it from the emotional part. They're driven by their emotions, and other people from thoughts. So I think people come to Oz in very different ways.
Let me ask Joanne, our administrator, if she could throw up the results to poll number 1. And while she's doing that, Catherine Allen, one of our board speakers, said, try the Harvard unconscious bias survey. It really is insightful in terms of where some of these unconscious drivers come from. Wally Yosefat asked the question.
Could I just comment on that, Jim, for 1 second?
Absolutely.
I think the diversity, inclusion, and equity field, I want to come back to something for a second, then I'll come back to the diversity. In terms of how executives learn, some people learn from a coach. Some people learn from a fellow executive in another industry. Some people learn from their spouse. A lot of people learn, a lot of men learn about the experience of women from their daughters. So we need to be open to the learning. Now, coming back to the unconscious bias, the diversity, inclusion, and equity issue has opened up a discussion about unconscious bias. And the way I think about this is that in order to step up and be an inclusive leader, you first and foremost have to be grounded and conscious. If you are not aware and you're not showing up as a healthy human being, then it's very difficult for you to show up as a respectful human being that understands the value and the strengths of other people. So unconscious bias is just another way to get to Oz. Jim, you were going to say something?
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's terrific. I just wanted to comment on the poll that is up. Wally Yosefat asked, he said, Executive Forum is an interesting and very diverse collection of executives. Does the polling that you see there in terms of very disruptive and somewhat disruptive sort of match the universe of people that you're talking to at the C-suite level?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So it is reflective. So Michelle Bottomley asks, for organizations that have embraced grounded and conscious leadership, are they more able to drive disruption? By business disruption, she means customer-centric growth, digital transformation, and leading with, personal experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What grounded and conscious does is it prepares people for disruption and opportunity. It gives people another tool in their toolkit that helps them show up, because the most important thing of leaders is to take care of yourself and to show up as a grounded and conscious person. They are able to hold paradox, live with uncertainty, imagine new business strategies, take risks, and also listen more deeply to customers. This is really a buyer's market. In many ways, and so we have to fundamentally change our relationships to our customers, to put ourselves in their shoes, to build relationships, to sense make with them as they're exploring options. And I think this requires a grounded and conscious perspective to do that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Phil Harvey asks, do you think it's healthy or best practice for a conscious, grounded leader to harness these strengths and actually name them to positively impact the company's public image or brand? It sort of is the Marshall Goldsmith thing. I just wanted to tell you, Bob, I'm really working on being, of delegating more. And just by mentioning that to his subordinate, the perception goes up by 50%. Maybe you can comment on that, using it for company success.
Yeah, I think people are hungry to have their leaders operate like this. In a remote environment, people are needing and wanting more relationship, not less, from their managers and leaders. And so how do you do that? You can quick start it by being a little more authentic and honest about yourself. And people know that it's complex and hard and that you don't have all the answers. Obviously, a leader needs to manage the anxiety of a team and organization. You can't just throw open the winds of uncertainty because people will get too scared. But there's a balance there. And I do think, these, by the way, these are great questions. I really appreciate that. And you know, we've been at this. I mean, it's all based on 30 years of research, but we've been bringing this into companies only in the last couple of years. And we've just seen that this recent set of crises is really forcing leaders and companies to really look at their lives and their businesses with a fundamentally new lens.
Well, that is a great summary comment. You will see when you review the chat, Bob, that there are lots of comments thanking you for your presentation. And
Jim, if you just hold 1 second, one of the things I wanted to show people is that we are offering, you know, as a gift to people, a new thought briefing that we just have written on the leader of the future. And I think it's going to be on your website, but you're also welcome to just send me an email. I'd love to keep in contact with you, and you all have a wonderful day.
thank you so much. And there is wild applause going on. I can hear the sounds in my basement. So this is now going back to Angus just to reinforce our time schedule